Well, welcome everyone. It's Thursday, and that usually means either a Lake Talk Live or a Talking Time. Tonight, it's a Lake Talk Live, and I'm really excited about tonight's discussion because we're going to be talking about bugs and entomology and all those good things that fish, trout, and other game fish eat. And for me, it was one of my initial attractions to the sport was, first realizing what lived in lakes in particular and rivers and streams, and it just really opened my eyes up to the natural world that's out there. And since that time I've been an entomology addict of sorts. I've been learning all I can about aquatic insects and invertebrates. I even had aquariums with them with insects in it. And during my travels I began reading some of my special guest tonight's books. Rick Hafele, aquatic insects and their imitations, a classic that he wrote with Dave Hughes, Western Hatches. He's got another excellent book here, more river orientated, but nymph fishing for rivers and streams. And arguably my favorite publication he and Dave did is this Western Mayfly Hatches, just an outstanding book. And I'm fortunate over the years to have developed what I call a good friendship with Rick. Rick, if you don't know, is a former aquatic entomologist by profession. He has a master's degree in aquatic entomology and a minor in fisheries. He worked as a professional aquatic biologist for over 30 years and specializing in using aquatic communities as water quality indicators. And coupled with that, he's also, as I showed you, an excellent fly fishing writer. He also, besides those books, penned a column in American Angler for over 30 years. He's got a new publication coming out, Rick Hafele's Favorite Flies and How to Fish Them. That's available in paperback or Kindle format through Amazon. He's also got a number of educational DVDs for those of you who remember what a DVD is. But as you can tell, I have a little bit of a liking for Rick's work and following. And, we've had an awful lot of fun together. I've got to fish with him a lot. And, his entomology, his knowledge and his feedback was instrumental. Rick provided guidance, advice, and sometimes I guess a little head shaking on me to get me on track on both my first book, Fly Patterns for Still Waters, and my recently released Orvis Guide to Orvis Guide to Stillwater Trout Fishing. And Rick reviewed that entire chapter, and we had some fantastic discussions, and Rick was gracious enough to pull me out of some entomological rabbit holes I seem to always get down. So let's bring Rick in, and let's get chatting about bugs. Hi, Rick. Thanks for joining me.
Phil. Hey, thanks, Phil. It's great to be here.
Yeah, how's the weather in Oregon?
Beautiful right now.
Yes.
We've got that 2-week stretch of February where we get spring weather, and then all hell changes again.
Yeah. We've been sort of freeze thaw. So generally we've got ice, and it melts, and then refreezes, and then snows on top. So it just makes traveling an adventure. But maybe I talked about some of your accomplishments. Is there anything else I missed? Any other things you'd like to tell our viewers?
Boy, thank you. You've covered all the. Well, I will say this: the one video. I was at a fly show, a fly club, and I had the videos out for sale. And I said, "Geez, like nobody has DVD players anymore." I was like, "Are you kidding?" But anyway, if you don't, there is on Vimeo. We have the advanced tactics for emergers and dries.
Oh, okay.
It is available on Vimeo that you can download for a one-time viewing or for permanent. On your.
And I also forgot to mention one video that was instrumental in my development as a fly fisher was your anatomy of a trout stream.
Yeah,
that was unbelievable. Where was that? Was that filmed on the Williamson in Oregon?
It was filmed in 4 or 5 places.
Okay.
A fair number, several spots in Montana, and on the Big Hole and Rock Creek and Spring Creek in Montana, and then we did some in Southern Oregon. And we did some on the Umpqua River, so we spread it around. But it was an interesting project, and when I see it now, it's frightening because I was 30 years old when I did that, and I don't look 30 years old anymore.
No, I'm 41, 42. You and me both. So we've got people from all over. We've got New Zealand. We've got Vancouver, Moscow, Idaho, Washington State, the Shuswap, which is in the interior of British Columbia. You've probably driven through there on your travels through Canada. So what
Absolutely.
we're going to talk to you about tonight is bugs. We solicited to get questions from everyone. We got some, but if you've got entomology questions, although I'm known for Stillwater stuff, we will entertain all things bugs. We've got a few things I want to discuss with Rick, but maybe we had a Janet Newman was gracious enough to give us a lot of questions, and it seems Janet likes to use fly patterns under the ice, and let's get that. So she said she loves fly fishing patterns under the ice. I generally fish leeches, scuds, and maybe bloodworms. 2 winters ago rather, I had phenomenal success on a size 14 chironomid pupa pattern. Are chironomid pupa active or even present under the ice in winter?
Well, I don't fish a lot under the ice here in Oregon. We don't get frozen lakes here,
Well,
but
rub it in.
but it's a very interesting question, and it's possible. It's not likely you're going to get a hatch of chironomids under the ice.
No.
There's nowhere for the adults to go, so it'd be a bad strategy for survival.
There'll be a lot of chironomids with flat heads pushing up against, but that's probably just a situation where that trout has seen so many chironomids or midges or buzzers, whatever you want to call them, during the open water season. They just instinctively react to one.
Yeah. And if it was in real shallow water and it warms up, even under the ice, if there's not a lot of snow on it, I guess you could get some little warming under there. But it would be more of the fish taking advantage of seeing something that looked like food.
Yeah, exactly. So with that winter theme in mind, what aquatic insects are most available to trout and active in the winter months?
That's a more interesting question. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the winter is when you have your highest population of the larval stages of aquatic insects.
Yeah.
Whether it's streams or lakes. Because in the summer, they've emerged as adults, and the adults have laid eggs, and those eggs take weeks to months to hatch. And so your lowest populations of the larval stages underwater on the substrate is in the summer.
Wow.
And your highest density of insects is in the winter. And so there's everything down there. You're going to have Calabetus nymphs, you're going to have chironomid larvae, you're going to have dragonfly nymphs, based scuds. Basically everything that you would know about that lake is going to be there, and relatively active. Insects are cold-blooded organisms, so they don't get as active in real cold temperatures. But insects are very capable of operating at surprisingly low temperatures.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, leeches would be there too, wouldn't they?
Oh yes.
Excuse me.
There, and I've seen water boatmen and back swimmers frozen in the ice.
Yeah.
And Hughes and I were fishing in Eastern Oregon. We found we thawed the ice out, and they swam away.
Yeah.
I was very impressed with that.
Well, I've often heard stories of people drilling holes in the ice, and those boatmen and back swimmers are able to survive in the little air pockets under there. And of course, when a big hole opens up, that's a lot of air for them, and they'll gravitate towards it. So that's interesting. So bloodworms we talked about. Do aquatic insects in general have metabolism similar to trout, in that they slow down quite a lot or move more slowly in the winter?
Yeah, I kind of alluded that they're around, and they have enzymes that are a bit different than trout, and they're able to be a little more active than a trout would tend to be.
Yeah,
in general, but they're going to be slower.
Yeah. And there's also a question around crayfish activity and availability to trout coming off when the ice is coming off and early in the spring. I don't get to fish crayfish patterns much for trout. I've done a little bit for smallmouth bass back east. Of course, smallies love those things. But I know trout would eat one if they were present. I guess a lot of times they're considered invasive, aren't they? Because they get into bodies of water and they can wreak havoc on the local environment.
Well, there's a couple of invasive species of crayfish that have been introduced to the West. And they've been very aggressive in populating places where they weren't before, and they do run out the native species of crayfish.
Yeah.
But trout will eat the invasive ones just as much as the native species. So they'll be around. I don't fish in those conditions myself here, but we have a lot of places where crayfish are an important part of the
Yeah.
trout's diet.
Yeah, especially because my research when I was doing some of the work for the book that you so graciously helped me with suggested, juvenile crayfish, the little guys and gals, they're not as nocturnal as their larger siblings, and of course that exposes them and gets them into probably trouble and into a gullet a little more often until they sort of figure out that maybe sitting out on a rock exposed on a warm day in the shallows is not long for this planet. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's some good questions there. I also had some questions, and Rick and I have had these discussions. I remember the day we were on the Missouri River with Dave. I think Dave thought we were nuts because he was busy fishing, and you and I were like two kids at Christmas, seining the runs and the riffles and just the insect population in that river is staggering.
It's stunning. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. I remember when somebody says, well, you see a fish rising, what could be eating it? You look in the water and it's like, well, there's every insect I can ever think of drifting by in some stage, whether that's emerging, crippled, stillborn. It was just overwhelming. So good thing was they'd eat a midge.
And I've got a picture from that trip with the surface covered with little blue-winged olive mayflies.
Yeah.
You look at it, and just thousands of them. And then you get the trico spinners. I mean, it's crazy.
I was amazed at the density of blue-winged olive, Baetis nymphs in that river. It was just, they were everywhere. And we also did that on the Deschutes one day, and that's a very rich body of water too.
Yeah.
We got all kinds in there. So go ahead.
The studies that have been done around North America, the Baetis or blue-winged olive species, which there's a group of them, are the most common, one of the most common aquatic insects in North America.
Yeah.
In any river you fish, you're going to have blue-winged olives.
Yeah. We got a question here about phytoplankton abundant this evening. Not sure what Brian's referring to there. Abundant this evening. So maybe Brian could explain that a little bit, or maybe he's just because in the lakes we have started to, because zooplankton feed on phytoplankton, and for years when we ran into fish focused on zooplankton, it was a pretty frustrating experience, but we've since adapted to hanging blobs under indicators to imitate clusters and just matching the colors, and some people might think it's a little
that's wild.
Yeah, but it works. Especially because that's usually something I run into in the late summer, early fall, when trout are still more out in the deeper water where it's more oxygenated until that water temperature drops, and they're just stuffed with that stuff. So for years that was, we couldn't handle it. Now we kind of rub our hands. Oh, they're on zooplankton. We can do this. So it's good fun. But one of the questions I had for you this evening, Rick, was in the West here, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, the difference in dragonfly nymphs. The three different, the three main families, if that's the right word to use. And we affectionately call them darners. And then the sprawlers are often called, particularly in lakes, are called gomphus, but they're really not, are they? They're
not. So the family Gomphi, which people would call gomphus, is a river group of dragonflies, very common in streams.
So that's what one looks like there.
There's one there, and I think the next photo kind of
shows their mouth parts. Yeah.
Well, that's the antennae that I've.
Oh, is that the antennae? Okay.
Yeah, that's the antennae, and that's the key difference. And that picture, unfortunately, didn't. The antennae wasn't standing out as well as I'd like, but it's a little flat, oblong structure looking antennae, right? It's where antennae would be, but it's flat and oblong, and that's a gomphus. That's a gomphus.
Yeah. And they're more. Sorry, Rick. They're more river-dwelling species, are they not?
Exactly.
Yeah. So they're not very widespread in lakes at all, and they also seem to be. To me, they're kind of this blend of the darners, Unishidae, the hourglass shaped ones, and the squat spider like sprawlers we call them, which we'll just
Right.
back up here. So these are your these insects don't play well with others. That one.
No, these guys will get, that's the Eschnids, the big darners. They'll get 3 inches long. You put them in an aquarium, you'll only end up with a few of those in your aquarium after a few weeks.
Yeah, I had one. I had a thriving as much as you can get those aquariums to thrive in 30-gallon aquarium, and I dropped one of these, guys in when he was about an inch long, thinking, what could go wrong? and that was July, early July, and by early October, he was or she was about 2.25, almost 2.5 inches long, and had decimated the aquarium. There was a couple of leeches left, and I remember watching it trying to eat one of those one day, and it was like an old Tarzan movie because this leech was wrapped around the dragonfly nymph, and the dragonfly nymph was trying to chew on that leech. The leech eventually broke free. Its back end's all chewed and tattered, and I swear that dragonfly just kind of shook his head and moved on to the next target. I watched them go up to a case caddis, and the caddis would see him and zip back in the case, and the dragonfly would just sit there. Almost like it knew, and that curiosity, well, I wonder if it's safe to go out, and out comes that jaw, woof, right out. Oh, just unbelievable. They'll eat each other.
Oh, yeah.
I always joke if they were a tropical fish and you look on the aquariums, definite non-community fish.
Yeah.
They are just lethal. How long's their life cycle? 4.5 years as a nymph?
No, so typically the Eschnids, which are the biggest, is going to be 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
If you're way up north where you are, who knows? Things might have to take 10 years to get but no, usually it's 2 to 3 years for the Eschnids. The little lulids, which are the lake sprawler group,
yeah, let's bring
about a year. They're about a year.
Yeah.
These guys right here. And see, the antennae on this is very distinct, slender antennae. The gomphid that we showed earlier has the big flat, like you stepped on them. And if you look at a round, squat dragonfly nymph from your lake, 99% of the time it's going to have these long antennae, and that's not a gomphis.
No, it's Lilibulidae. We just call them sprawlers. Now these guys, whereas the darners, as we call them, they're, to me, I watched them in my aquariums. They hunted more like a cat, where they would stalk around, use a lot of stealth, and all dragonflies have that ability to compress their abdomens and shoot a focused little burst out of their rectal gill chamber. I got a friend who loves it when I say that. Out of the tip of their abdomen is probably more politically correct, and then just this bull rush to last second pounce. Whereas these ones are ambush feeders, aren't they? They just sit.
Yeah, if you it's a little hard to see in that photo, but they have little hairs on them, and they just sit on the bottom. They sort of get little silt and debris accumulating on to their hairs, so they're very camouflaged. And they just sit and wait. They're an ambush hunter. They just sit and wait for a scud to come by or a Calabetus nymph, whatever. And then if the next picture, I think, shows
their jaw,
you can see the little arm-like elbow there that allows them to shoot that lower mouth part out, called labium, about half the body length in front of them to grab.
Yeah, it's incredible. I watched one of their larger cousins, the darners. It was a good half an inch, and it comes out, grabs, and as it's pulling back, it's already starting the chewing up process. It seems like a pretty horrible way to go.
Well,
they almost look like they're smiling, don't they? Kind of sinister.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, back 100 million years ago, these guys were 2 feet long, 3 feet long.
I guess walking and waiting wouldn't have been a good thing back then.
It would have been a unique experience fishing. Yeah.
Guy with missing his leg from his knee down or something.
I would have loved to have seen those guys
from a distance. All right. The next thing I thought we'd talk about is this: why are chironomid larvae red, and sort of discussion of how an insect's respiratory and blood system is different than the human. Because I think it often gets confused, and people assume that they operate on the same manner we do.
Yeah. Now you don't fish chironomids up there, do you?
I'm just learning about them. They seem to be,
Man, I tell you, chironomid fishing is like it's an amazing. And you and Brian Chan have just done some amazing videos on that stuff, and it's been really helpful. So the whole thing with you were talking about respiration system and so forth. Bloodworms are unique. Let me talk about the ones that most insects are not bloodworms. They don't carry the blood, or they don't carry the oxygen in their blood. Insects have a separate tracheal system for transporting oxygen around the body. And so the blood is not, it doesn't have to be pumped to all the cells. I mean, it does for nutrients and waste excretion, but it's not used to transport oxygen. So they have a separate tracheal system. The insects with the gills underwater, the oxygen from dissolved in the water flows into the body through those gills, but it enters that tracheal system. When you look at the gills on a mayfly nymph or a damsel nymph at the tails, you see those trachea, those little, kind of leaf-like veins through the gills. Those are the trachea where the oxygen then gets mobilized, and it's really capillary action, because when you're that small, you don't need a big pump.
Yeah.
And it's really capillary action that and gas pressure differentials in the body that allow the oxygen to get around to all the cells and keep them alive. And they do have some chemicals in there to help in that process, but it's called hemocyanin instead of hemoglobin.
Yeah.
And so when you squish a bug and you see the yellowish green stuff besides, internal organs, some of the liquid there is hemocyanin. And bloodworms are unique because they actually have hemoglobin.
Yeah.
And they're able to extract oxygen out of the water. And a lot of that diffuses just through the exoskeleton, through the cuticle, into that hemolymph that has hemoglobin in it. So they're really quite unique in that regard.
And that's probably because they feed on detritus for the most part, right? And that's a high rate of, decaying plant matter, high rates of decomposition, low oxygen.
Absolutely. And they can live in deep water where there's very little sunlight and a lot of decomposition. So your oxygen levels could be close to zero.
Yeah.
And they can survive in those areas. And they've been adapted by actually having hemoglobin.
So is it this picture here, Brian provided to me, really unique picture of what looks to be a chironomid larva that is, I think its primary color is that green coloration, but is somehow in the process of supplementing itself with that oxygen you talked about to survive. Because we often see this kind of coloration of larvae in the fall months, as though they've gone through that warm water summer period, low oxygen, and are now starting to return to their natal color because the lake has turned over. It's cooler, it's more oxygenated, and we often see this kind of color, almost like a barber pole or a candy cane, where the body segments will alternate between green and red. So that sort of explains it, I guess, because that's.
And this is, I'm not familiar with this coloration. You see this commonly?
Yeah, we see it from time to time, particularly in the fall months. I've run across it. This kind of alternating, and it's really weird. Most of the bloodworm we see are either that scarlet red, a blood red, or even a more of a maroon, deep, rich, like a low oxygenated blood red, that kind of thing. But no, we do see it's. I've to me, the way insects and invertebrates go, anything's possible, right? Because they're so unique how they've adapted to life on this planet.
And there's 1,000 or more species of chironomids. And I just see a question here from Patrick: is bloodworm the pupa stage of a chironomid? No, it's not. Bloodworm is the larval stage, and what we showed in the previous picture, and this one is the larva.
Yeah.
And so that's going to transition into a pupa before it can become an adult.
Which is, oops, I missed. I'm going to skip to the end. We'll come back to, because there's the pupa.
Yeah.
That's the pupal stage. I got this out of, and I guess my question, the interesting thing with chironomids and other, I think Gary LaFontaine was one of the first in his book Caddisflies to really talk about how aquatic insects use trapped gases to elevate their way to help elevate their way to the surface and emerge. How is that? You told me once it was part of a process called. You sent me a video on it with the grasshopper, and I've just
Yeah,
gone blank.
it's
Um,
called Apolysis,
Apolysis, that's right.
which
Yeah.
is the name of my company that I have for my fly fishing business. I named it Apolysis, which
Ooh.
everybody looks at and goes, "What the hell's that?"
Well,
But I know.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's a point in the transition from pupa to adult where the pupa exoskeleton separates from the formed adult exoskeleton that's inside the pupa.
Yeah.
And there's a space between those two layers of exoskeleton. And that's where the gas layer forms. And it helps the insects split the pupa exoskeleton open so the adult can escape quickly. But in the process, it also helps float them to the
Yeah.
surface. And for insects like chironomid pupa that are poor swimmers, it's really a very valuable sort of tool in their basket there to help them get to the surface. But the one thing that's worth mentioning about these that pupa stage is that they've discovered that these pupa will emerge from the substrate, but they'll hang out just inches off the
Yeah.
substrate for hours or even
Days.
24 hours.
Yeah, I've seen them. I had one once in my aquarium, and I quickly separated him from the rest of the general population because he would have been lunch. He was like I'm sure he looked like a big potato chip hanging down there. And it took him, I want to say, at least 2 days before he decided to. And that was one of those big bombers we talk about.
Yeah.
And eventually it hatched and flew off and probably became spider food in my garage at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
And so, that period of time, they're just hanging off the bottom and they'd be like krill down there to a trout, and the trout can just swim along with their mouth open and stuff themselves.
Yeah, we've had, we've done throat samples, and we've taken. I remember taking a tiger trout in Manitoba right off the bottom, within a foot or so, had a few of the larval stage in it, even a few larvae that looked to be in transformation. Their head was starting to become bulbous. They were still larvae, but they were starting to morph in, over time. But all of those pupa were a deep red, maroon red coloration, almost as though they still had that residual hemoglobin. And I was watching them slowly turning more of a green olive because they were hardly moving. They were just sort of doing this because, like you said, they were just suspending off the bottom. That trout probably just mowed right through them all. And he had to have 40 of them in there. It was just a fascinating thing to see because we usually see this when the hatch is really getting intense, they're gassed up, and now they're starting that elevation process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they do have some unique coloration to them. And of course, you guys that tie the great patterns have come up with a lot of ways to get a nice, kind of bright color, not bright, but just that translucence kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, we use things like originally when I did my chromie, it was silver flashabou. Now we're using anti-static bags, window tint. There was an original color of flashabou number 6916. Sadly, they changed the dye lot on it. So if you've got some of the original stuff, you use every strand to its complete max.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we got a question here from Jack. Thanks for posing that question. Is that the stage at the bottom? Do they continue to have red ribs?
I wouldn't know why not, but I can't say that I have firsthand look at those that are on.
Yeah, we've often, if people ask Brian and I, if you had one color chironomid, what would it be? And it would be a black body with a red rib, because we often see them with that residual hemoglobin at the tip of the abdomen sometimes, and then right along the body segments. And that's a typical, that kind of dark, somber pattern is something, as we just discussed, we'd use early in that emergence when they've just transitioned from the larval stage and are suspending. And then as the hatch intensifies, then we start bringing out the Christmas lights and all that stuff, all the shiny ones to go there.
Well, and the other thing, Phil, that I'm sure you've run into is that the area of the lake where the pupa are emerging from can be quite narrow and isolated. And it's not like it's happening over the whole lake. and you
No.
need to be in the right spot to be in that zone where the fishing is good. And if you're
Yeah.
out of, it can be a fairly narrow area in the lake where the big hatch of chironomids is
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. We often see, and it also, so we'll see that localized emergence, and then we'll also see, there could be 3 or 4 different species coming off throughout the day. So you'll see these size and color fluctuations. And that's where I often get asked when we're throat pumping fish, do we do every one? And it's like, no, we're trying not to. We're trying to be as, I call it minimally invasive as possible. But that's a lot of times in the spring. It's the only way to sort of stay in touch because they'll flip on a switch, and all of a sudden you're catching lots on maybe a lime green colored one, and then it goes quiet, and you stumble into another fish, you throat pump it, and it's totally changed. It's gone to something different, right?
Yeah.
Different
Yeah.
size, different color. They really cause hair loss.
Yeah.
So they're a fascinating. Again, insects in general, just my fascination with them. It's so nice to find somebody like yourself who's just as we're just as happy knee deep in a river or along the shoreline of a lake, rummaging around for bugs than fishing sometimes.
Well, and the chironomids are the most diverse group out there in
Yeah,
terms of number of species and abundance.
yeah.
And so you got to learn to understand them and live with them if you want to be successful.
Well, and even on rivers, right, midging? Those are
Oh,
chironomids.
everywhere,
Yeah,
everywhere. And if you fished in puddles, you'd have to match chironomids too.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'll keep that in mind when winter finally leaves. Oh, puddles.
yeah,
Let's talk about another favorite insect of ours, Calabatus.
yeah. That one always gets excited.
Yeah,
I get excited about because it's such a great hatch and a common one all around out around North America.
yeah,
Now there's the nymphal stage, and these guys are great swimmers. They look like a swimmer, right? I
yeah,
mean, just the streamline, the long tails, and they flip the abdomen up and down. They swim very well. They're very quick,
yeah.
and there's multiple species out there in the West. We've got about 4 species that are very common, but it doesn't matter. You're going to have some variation in size and color. What I tell people about color, when the substrate you're over and fishing is going to be generally the color of the bug, the
Yeah,
nymph.
that's what I say too. Yeah, you use that as your, the color of the weeds, the bottom.
Yep.
Being sharp, being hot orange is not long for this planet.
Yeah, for an
Yeah,
attractor, it's good, but not
yeah,
for the natural. Yeah. And so, yeah, if they're on wood debris and logs, they're going to be browns and grays. If they're on, aquatic plants, they're going to be olives and various shades of olive.
yeah,
So, yeah. And that picture shows the nice dark wing pads.
yeah.
And when you
Right here.
see that, when I go out and collect chironomids, the Calabetus nymphs with a net, they're going to be in close to shore. They don't go out in real deep water.
Yeah.
You do a little seining close to shore. If they're out there, you're going to find them. And I always like to look for those dark wing pads. That means those guys are ready to hatch. When you
So
see a nymph with dark wing pads like that, get ready to see an emergence.
time to call in sick.
Time to call in sick.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And of course, they swim up to the surface, little rapid undulations of their. The first time I ever saw them, I thought it was a little minnow because of the way they darted. Right,
Yes.
and then because
Yes.
your brain just says minnow, that kind of body motion. And you look a little closer. Oh no, it's a nymph.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then
And Ralph
go ahead.
Cutter in his video Bugwater has some
Yeah.
great underwater shots of the Calabetus swimming up to the surface to emerge.
Yeah, that's an incredible video. If any of you out there have not seen that video, you should. He's got
Yeah.
some. I can't imagine the time that went in to get that kind of footage because
Yeah.
it's incredible though. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So these guys swim up to the surface, split forms along their back, and then this is the little nuance with mayflies, isn't it? This 2-stage adult cycle, isn't it?
Yeah. Unique among all insects. Mayflies are the only ones. Mayflies are the oldest. In fact, they're thought perhaps to have been the first insects to actually fly.
Wow.
There's fossil evidence of very similar critters around 300 million years ago. So anyway, they have the residual trait that's very ancient and a very interesting one where they have to molt one more time to be sexually mature. After they get wings in this stage, the dun stage, they have to molt into the spinner. and it's the spinners that actually mate and lay their eggs. When they emerge from the nymph, the duns and spinners have no mouth parts. They can't eat. So obviously they don't live long. They can't even get any water. So
I,
um,
I understand that affects their body color early in the spring. Your earlier hatches, they'll be darker to absorb heat and keep themselves moving. Yet, you know, later in the season, if it's another hatch, another brood coming off, they may be lighter to reflect light and heat, so they don't get dehydrated.
Dehydration is a huge problem
Yeah.
for all aquatic life.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And they've done experiments where they've raised the nymphs, mayfly nymphs, and I'm not sure it was Calabetus, but
Yeah.
they've raised mayfly nymphs at different temperatures of water,
Yeah.
and the duns come out a different color
Wow.
depending on the temperature of the water that they were raised in. So, there's a lot of variables out there when we start talking fly patterns and somebody, what color should I tie my Calabetus dun?
Yeah.
Well, this tan's a good color, but you might see them in gray, you might see them
Yeah.
in olive.
Yeah.
And so there's no one answer to that question. And you need to observe and, maybe take some fly tying stuff with
Yeah.
you when
Yeah.
you're fishing.
Yeah. Or bring Dave along, Dave Hughes.
Yeah, bring somebody along that has this massive collection of flies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they transform into this stage. This is the sexually mature or the spinner stage, right?
Yes, and you can see the big
Model.
change in the wing color. Mayfly duns are always going to have an opaque wing, not as opaque as the Calabetus dun, but nonetheless they'll be opaque. And in the spinner stage, the wings are transparent, and that's really how you tell the difference. And this is a male. Males have big eyes.
Yeah.
So you got to find the females in the swarms, mating swarms. But here's the really cool thing about Calabetus: they're going to mate like a typical mayfly up in the air. And normally, after mating, the females drop to the water and start laying eggs. Calabetus don't do that.
Ooh, interesting.
Calabetus, the females fly off after mating and land in the vegetation along the lake and hang out for up to 5 days.
Wow.
And during that period, the eggs are gestating in the abdomen. They come back after that 4 or 5 day period to lay them. And the eggs hatch within seconds of touching the water. And so you might see a really good dun emergence and no spinner fall at all. Or you might be out there and there's no dun activity. You don't see any hatch. And then all of a sudden at 4 in the afternoon, you get a great spinner fall out of the blue. And you go, where'd they come from?
Yeah.
And so you can't predict what kind of spinner fall you're going to get based on the kind of hatch of duns you saw during the day.
Yeah, I remember seeing a video, I think it was on Facebook, somebody put up of a mayfly. No, I assume it to be a Calabetus now, where literally you saw, the quiver and that female's going through her final throes of life, and then all those eggs come out like snow, and all of a sudden they just burst. They hadn't sunk an inch, and they burst into life. And it was just in an aquarium setting, and by the time they got to the bottom, they were off and running.
Yeah, I saw that same video. It was fascinating. It was great.
It was fascinating.
Yeah, it was a great shot. But
okay.
So that's kind of cool about that behavior. There are some other mayflies that do that. It's very uncommon, but and Calabetus are ones that we see all the time that do that.
Yeah, and unfortunately in lakes, you as a more of a river and stream angler, you get to see a lot of different species of mayflies. We don't get to see near the diversity of species you get. We get Calabetus, Hexagena, maybe some gray drakes.
Yeah, there's the gray drake, and then you also get a Leptophlebia, which would be the common name. I'm trying to think what the common name would be for that.
Yeah.
Leptophlebia is a good size mayfly. It would be like a size 10.
Oh, I like those.
And it would, and I've run into them in Kamloops area, but very sparse. It wasn't like, there's a big hatch coming off. It was like, God, what's that mayfly? And I ran over and grabbed it, and it was a Leptophlebia.
Well, I remember that time we had caught that March brown on the Deschutes, and you'd never seen that before. And again, other people would probably think we're nuts, but I remember being back at your house going through all your taxonomy charts and identifying that it was a March brown in the end, but you were a little flummoxed by it at first.
It was a different species of Erythrogene.
Yeah, incredible.
Which Fish don't get hung up on that as much.
No, and I think that's the important thing. This is fun for us to get into and stuff, but the fish don't. You know,
Yeah,
they don't care. I always say if they can see that kind of detail, we're not catching them because I still say, how do they consistently miss that big hook that hangs below every fly? They just seem to skip that whole thing, thankfully. So there's a question here, and I'm assuming it's talking about calaveras' their lifespan in the bottom of lakes before hatching. So
yeah,
how long?
it's roughly, well, that's a really good question because calaveras have multiple generations a year. So you get a spring hatch, usually not long after ice out. And around here we don't have ice. Say April, you start
Yeah,
in the lower elevation lakes, you start getting hatches. Um, and those critters were in the larvae were out there since maybe October, so however long that is, 8 months or
yeah,
so. But then those eggs that are laid from that hatch in April, the larva will grow quickly. Within 8 weeks, couple of months, you'll have another hatch,
yeah,
and they'll lay eggs, and that larva will grow quickly, and you'll get a third hatch in the fall. High elevation lakes, you're probably going to get 2 generations a year, not 3. So their lifespan as larva is shorter. Can be as short as 2 months, but the overwintering stage is about maybe 7 or 8 months.
yeah. You always see your biggest hatches in the spring because they've had that overwintering period to grow,
Right.
whereas the next generation has, like you say, weeks or months to go. There's another question here on the calabatus hatch. Is the tail below the water with the thorax floating to
It's
dry the wings?
That's a great question. I have some really good photos of that. They're not. The tails are not below the water. I can say
Yeah,
the ones I've got good pictures of, the tails are sticking up in the air. Think of that as being on the water instead of the
yeah,
stick. The
yeah,
tails are up in the air like that.
yeah. Arched up. Yeah, they
Yeah.
are. They're an exciting hatch. We get
Now
to
you
see.
do get a lot of cripples,
Yeah,
especially and this is the other thing. Calaveras like to hatch in crappy weather.
yeah,
Not horrible weather, but if you get a little squall come through with some rain, you'll get a hatch come off during that squall. The sun comes back out and the hatch will stop. And then you get another little squall, a cloud, and a little drizzle. Boom, you'll get some bugs hatching. And so if the wind's blowing, you get cripples. And I often use a little soft hackle
yeah.
uh, that I just wind drift in the surface film as a cripple. And that can work really well if they're being fussy.
Yeah, I've done that too because if you look at a lot of the English style dry flies, they're not they're damp. They sit on or in the film, and sometimes they can be more effective than a traditional
Yes.
dry. I know we do use a lot of the parachute Adams because depending on how you can dress that, you can get that to sit quite low in the film, and it makes a plausible cripple or stillborn.
And I think cripples are great patterns to use
Yeah,
in a lot of hatch situations. And spinners, don't overlook the spinner pattern. A
yeah,
lot of people forget about it.
yeah. So you should take your best dry fly and then step on it, make it
Exactly.
yeah, and then throw it out. So
And the
yeah,
parachute Adams can work for a spinner too.
so.
Yeah.
Oh, this is my buddy Ryan. This just in. Rick Hafele is cooler than Phil Rowley. He is definitely
I
cooler.
like that guy. I like
Yeah.
Ryan, you're my man.
Yeah. well, Brian's been sick a little bit lately, so it's good he's feeling better. There was another question up here I saw about back to chironomids. No, we've answered that one. It was.
Okay, we saw that.
I saw that one. I missed it. Where's it going? Darn it all. Where's that? Oh, there we go. How do chironomids move themselves through the water and do their speeds vary?
The pupa
Yeah.
move themselves with a little
Snake-like wiggle, isn't it?
like wiggle, yeah. And they do have a little paddle like tail at the end. It's very small. It's not long like a tail, but it's a little paddle like thing.
Yeah.
And that does help them wiggle up to the surface. And they're going to be vertical. They're kind of, coming straight up. So that's the other thing you want to, kind of manage here. I'm trying to
Okay.
see my hand.
It almost seems like when they're deeper and they've just come out of that larval stage, they're kind of slow and lethargic, and then as they get more and more gassed up, it's almost like there's a sense of excitement that they might actually elevate their way up to safety, relative safely, because there's every bird on the planet seems to be waiting for them next. It's almost like they seem to pick up the tempo a little bit as they get closer to the surface and get more and more active.
Well, and the other thing is, as you come up from depth, the gas expands more, right? Just like
Yeah,
a diver coming up from the bottom.
yeah,
So
I
that,
think that also I've thought about that myself. Is that probably intensifies the reflective nature of the gas because
yes,
that pupil skin can now expand, and
yes,
yeah, yeah, and Callibatus use that same technique as well, don't they? I've seen some
they do.
samples where they're quite the nymphs are quite shiny.
Yeah, but they're not coming up from very deep water like
Yeah,
some chironomapute.
yeah.
But nonetheless, they do have that shiny, yeah, gases
So,
in there.
so another question I have, and I remember this when you were still writing the column for American Angler, your entomology column.
Yeah.
You did a fascinating article on the impacts of temperature on insect emergences. How for some it delays until the rest catch up. For others, it's just like a switch flip and they all go. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I just found it fascinating.
Well, it's a long subject. We could spend the next hour talking about it, and it is fascinating.
Yeah,
And it's like anything in entomology. There's no all insects do it differently. So there's not one way insects do it. It depends on the insect, and some are responding to temperature in one way. Another group of insects will respond in a different way. But in general, um, there's enzymes called juvenile growth hormones that are triggered by a combination of temperature and photoperiod.
yeah,
And when those juvenile growth hormones are triggered, that sort of tells them that they're not going to molt into a bigger larva next molt. They're going to molt into the adult, or they're going to molt into the pupa stage, right? And so if it's photoperiod, say they're coming along and all of a sudden it's March 21st, it's the spring equinox, boom, that triggers this growth hormone and it says, boom, okay guys, we're going to be working on our adult tissue now, not our larva tissue, and we're going to get ready to emerge. Well, then that emergence, though, when they're actually going to, is triggered by temperature. But if that growth hormone isn't triggered by photoperiod, they're not going to do anything to become an adult. They're just going to keep hanging out as a larva, and they're going to, oh, well, this is fine. I'm just going to keep eating, no matter what the temperature is.
yeah.
So they interact with photoperiod, and temperature interacts.
That's probably explains, that question right back in the beginning about, why wouldn't an insect hatch under the ice? Because water temperatures are cool, and of course, if there's snow on
Photoperiod.
the ice, there's no photo period, there's no light, so they're just gonna
Yeah.
keep on that. That's fascinating stuff. I really enjoyed that article. It was just
Yeah.
incredible how these for such a what we think is a really small, simplistic creature is
Yeah.
really unbelievably complex, and the evolutionary developments they've made over their from way back when Dave Hughes was younger.
Yeah. I know.
We always have that teasing amongst the three of us.
I have I saw Dave just for the Super Bowl. I was
Yeah.
over watching it with Dave, so he's still alive.
Oh, good, good. Give him my best. I miss him. I'm glad the world seems to be settling down, and we've talked about getting together for a trip for a number of years
Oh,
now. We did the Missouri together, but see if we can get you up and really make your dollar work for you. Okay, we got a question here. What's the smallest chironomid you would fish? I think this is a Stillwater question because
that's for you, Phil. I know that might depend on person's age too, but go
yeah,
ahead.
well, yeah, the ability to. I know when we were on the Missouri, I was scoffing because I was fishing midges. I said I drove all the way down here to fish chironomids. Right, I was hoping to get into,
Yeah,
um, you know,
salmon fly hatch.
yeah. Well, it was funny because we ran into tricos, and I'm like, oh, that's small. And then, what were the micro beatus they're called? What's they used to,
Microcatus.
no,
Oh
we ran
no,
into,
the acentrella.
yeah, that's what they're called because they used to be called something else, right?
Pseudocolion. They used to be
Yeah,
called pseudocolion.
yeah. I teased you one time that you guys all get together over a good bottle of single malt, change everything, and then your book is the most current. So, but that's a lot of change from genetics, right?
Yeah.
The way you can, you didn't have that years ago to identify species.
That's certainly entering into it nowadays with doing the genetic mapping, gene mapping, and finding
Yep.
out relationships between species that they didn't, couldn't get
Yep.
a handle on before. Um, but the question here,
Yep.
smallest chironomid you would fish. What is it, Phil? Tell me.
For me, I used to have a good friend of mine who's a guide that says if they're eating size 16, they're not getting them from me. But I fish 16s and 18s on occasion in lakes. Thankfully, most times your stillwater chironomid species tend to be larger than the river and stream species, whereas an 18 on the Missouri again down in Montana is a big
Yeah.
midge, right? So yeah, I always recommend sort of that 16 to 10 if you're using, and hook style comes into this too. If you're using scud hooks, you can get away with a little bigger one because they're a shorter shank. But I know a lot of people like to tie their chironomids on 2XL slightly curved hooks. So I always tell people that when I was learning how to tie, you had to, because most of the hooks we used were mustad, you had to understand the relationship of the hook shank length versus the size, because you may not have a number 10 standard, but a 12 2X is about the same, and those kind of things. So they're
Yeah.
spoiled nowadays. You can go get anything. Okay, we got some other great questions starting to show up here. Um, do calibatus cripples move or dead drift?
Dead drift.
Yeah.
Yeah, dead drift. I just let the wind drift my fly across the
Yeah.
surface and just a slow hand twist retrieve so you don't have any slack in your lead.
Yeah.
And you're not really setting the hook. The fish is going to grab it and just keep swimming, and you just lift up.
Yeah, those are the best takes. That like a wet fly swing, just that little stab of
Yeah.
fish.
Yeah.
All right. At what point do calibatus go from 3 tails to 2?
Oh, good question.
Yes.
So they have 3
Observe
tails
it.
as
Yeah.
a nymph.
Yeah.
And when they emerge to a dun, they're going to have 2. And so the dun and spinner have 2 tails. There's a whole group of mayflies, the crawlers, that group of pale morning duns, green drakes, so forth. They have 3 tails as nymphs and adults.
Yeah.
But swimmers, all the swimmers, blue-winged olives, calibatus, amyloidus, the red duns and stuff, they have 3 as nymphs, 2 as adults.
So is it just in that when they're emerging, it just they delete one?
Yep. When they leave that nymphal shuck, they come out with 2 tails instead of 3.
Could that be for something as simple as it's easier to fly with 2? They're more streamlined as opposed to, and 3 as a nymph, it's better to swim and move with, or I don't know.
I'm sure swimming is part of the reason for 3, but as adults, those 2 tails are more like little stabilizers in the air. And whether 2 or 3 is better, who knows?
All right, we got a couple of ant questions here.
I love ants.
Oh, good. So right into your wheelhouse. So Travis is asking, what do either of you guys know about the Henry's Fork honey ant having something very special about it? I heard it contains something the fish love, but haven't corroborated this info yet.
So I can't speak specifically to the honey ant on the Henry's Fork, but ants overall have formic acid, which fish love. And everywhere I've ever fished for trout, if there's ants around, the fish are going to target them.
Yeah.
And lakes or streams, doesn't matter. I was fishing a lake with a hexagenia hatch 2 years ago, and hexes are popping up. The fish are taking the ants. And you had to put on a size 12 ant or 14 ant, and you were just catching the heck out of them.
Is it true that after a while that formic acid, because after a heavy feeding of ants, fishing often slows, right? And I always thought it was a combination of that too much formic acid, like me and jalapenos, and just that hard body they've got to process and digest it, and they're still full and a little.
I think on an individual basis, on an individual trout, an individual trout's going to get stuffed and it's going to stop feeding and have to digest and deal with it. Yeah. But in terms of a lake with a bunch of trout in it, if there's ants around, they're taking ants.
We see, and you probably get them down there, those big carpenter ants.
Oh, yeah.
I always joke because they're so big they carry tool belts, but they get on the water and it's just, these are 8s. They're massive. You step on them and they crunch, or they push you off. And that's pretty exciting. Okay, flying ants.
Why do they land on the water? across major hedge before, of course, they're all. I thought they
Yeah.
were. Yeah, well, they're definitely land. They're terrestrial,
Yeah.
and they're only landing in the water because they screwed up.
Yeah.
The wind's blown them in, or they on a mating flight. The mating flight took them. The reason they're flying is to mate and start new colonies. So there's queens and there's males, and they're all flying around, and they're going to mate and start new colonies, nests, and they just take off in all directions.
Yeah.
And some directions happen to be over water, or the wind is blowing them.
Yeah. And they just get on a, it's more water than they thought, and they run out of energy. And
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
and
it's pretty
it's,
exciting.
so it's a lucky mistake on our part.
All right. Phil's asking, great name, Phil. I frequently fish in northern Minnesota when huge mayflies are hatching in numbers. They calling in snowplows to clear the road. I've had no success at such times. Please share ideas for catching fish in such circumstances.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Hexagena, limbata.
Yeah, that's the big hex hatch.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is the fish are stuffed,
Yeah.
and there's so many insects around, your flies lost in the masses.
Yeah.
Um,
That's one of the things about insects is just the sheer volume with which they emerge. I saw an interesting special once on locusts in Australia, and how everybody sort of assumed that the natural predators would just be, this is great, and they did a little experiment. They had one of the lizards out there and dumped a few in his little aquarium, and he could handle that. Oh, this is great. It's just, and then they just almost buried him, and he just almost froze. He couldn't process that amount of food,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And he literally, like, he didn't know where to go, right?
yeah,
It was fascinating. So I
yeah.
feel that's one of the reasons they do it, right? Just to
Oh, yeah,
volume.
yeah.
Yeah, those.
Um, so in terms of fishing in that circumstance, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I think you're kind of stuck in some ways, because the fish are going to focus on that food source. You might try fishing something completely different.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
something. Well, we fish a lot of, we do a lot of attractor fishing too, where we just fish something gaudy, fish it at pace, because, I believe trout don't always take our flies out of a feeding instinct. It's just a
right.
curiosity, aggression. Maybe you got it in their space and they just snapped at it. Those. So do you only fish? Do you fish these only in still water? You can have success in the stream. I'm assuming this is relating to the ant question we got into, but Hugh, correct
Ants,
me if I'm wrong.
yeah. If you're talking about ants, absolutely streams as well as lakes, absolutely.
Same with beetles too. They're a common.
I was on the Lochsaw River in Idaho a couple of years ago in September, and I was expecting the blue-winged olives, and there's a couple other mayflies. There's an Amanita hatch, then some nice stuff coming off, and it was ants, but they're
Yeah.
small. They were size 18.
Ooh.
So don't think about Carpenter, And I saw these little ants flying by me, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, man, they're tiny. I thought, geez. And then I saw these little rises in this current seam, and I thought they must be taking ants. And I had a little 18 parachute ant that a fellow in Montana gave me. I put that on, and it killed them. Just absolutely killed them.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. Another question here. The mantra seems to be that you dead drift your nymphs stream fishing. Do you guys think animating them has any merit?
Well, talking streams, yes and no. A lot of times the current's enough to animate your nymph. Caddis pupa is one thing I do give more thought to animating than, say, mayfly nymphs or stonefly nymphs. Caddis pupa are great swimmers, and that's true in lakes too.
Yes, they are. The big travelers.
Yeah. So with caddis, there's the Liza ring lift and, wet fly swings. I give a little action to it. But in lakes, you have to, of course, impart some action if you're going to do that. Dragon nymphs,
usually you got to move, and we can do a few things with wind-induced current. Like, we often, use a reach cast and use that wind-induced current to swing flies around. It's a great way when you're fishing a food source that moves slowly, like a chironomid pupa, but you can just cover some water with it as opposed to just sort of fishing it in one area. So, Rick, what's your favorite bug? You know, mine's probably chironomids, but I'm going to ask you what your favorite is. If you had one insect,
Um,
I
well,
know it's hard.
you know, boy, that's really tough. I would lean towards the mayflies.
Yeah,
Um, favorite mayfly. Well, I'll just say blue-winged olives
yeah, I would think that would be.
because they're so darn effective
Yeah,
in catching trout. When blue-winged olives are on the water, mayfly hatches will be ignored.
yeah,
Other insects on the water will be ignored, and they'll take the blue-winged olives.
yeah,
So if there's one group of fly patterns I would take everywhere with me if I'm stream fishing,
yeah,
would be blue-winged olive patterns.
yeah,
Period.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, anywhere in North America.
yeah. No, they're everywhere. And again, if you want to learn more about, I can't plug this book enough. I know Rick's going to get tired of this, but this book, Western Mayfly Hatches, is just unbelievable because
It is out of print now, Phil.
oh, great.
And
Well,
and
oh, I can make some money. I'm going to. No, I'm
and
not.
and Dave and I have copies. So
Oh,
if you want a copy, go to my website, and there's a link to buying them on my website.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put the
Dave and
link.
I bought the last bundles from Amato when it
Yeah.
went out.
Yeah, Brian shares my affection for this book, both for river and lakes. I just love the way you laid it out. You took obviously a pretty complex insect and sort of broke it out just with, there's so many species, but these are the ones like you mentioned with the blue-winged olives. Here's why you need to focus on them and why, just because of their availability, their accessibility, because you go through and you've got these wonderful charts, obviously the hatch charts when they're most available, but their hatch importance score rated on distribution, abundance, emergence type, all these factors, right? And I just fell in love with this book. So well done, well done.
Thank
You
you.
doing another one?
Wow.
Uh,
Good question.
yes, sorry, put you on the spot. Let's change gears again. Jack's asking, what's the best tactic to catch the evening traveling sedge hatch? I guess be there when they're there. Yeah.
When they're there. So the traveling sedges I've fished in Kamloops have been kind of midday hatches.
Yeah. I ran into them in Wyoming on Monster Lake near Cody. They
Yeah.
were coming off in the middle of the day, and it was
Yeah.
just unbelievable. Totally didn't expect it. Was expecting to fish chironomids or calabatus or something, and they were just everywhere and did really well fishing. We have a pattern called a Mikulak sedge. It's like a three-winged caddis. You're probably familiar with it.
Too.
Yeah, but we were getting them on the trout were just so tuned in to anything that made a wake Chernobyl ants because the legs would kick and suggest a skating adult.
Yeah.
But I find a lot of our western waters in Canada, the sedge or caddis population is not as strong as it used to be. I think there's been a lot of impacts to the low water years. Basically leaving the larvae high and dry on the shoals, and they're tough to repopulate, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And there's probably been a change in some water chemistry, perhaps, too. And water temperatures are changing, and that's influencing distribution of some insects as well.
Yeah. Mayflies on the Mississippi, Minnesota means you quit fishing. It's notoriously brutal.
There you go. Thank you for that answer, Travis.
A good question from Janet. We answered some of her questions. Can you talk a little bit about scuds?
Oh, man. Yeah. They're around all the time for fish to feed on them.
Yeah.
And they are nocturnal, but they're active during the day too, but they are particularly nocturnal. So here's a question that ties into this.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what your answer is, Phil. Full moon versus new moon and how it influences your fishing and success.
I'm not a fan of full moons.
Yeah.
Okay. And for years, and I touched on it in my book, for years, they feed all night. So I went out at night, and while I had a nice sort of quiet experience and nobody else out there with me, the fish weren't out there. And I started to think about it, particularly if you look at a scud. that doesn't like bright light. So
Right.
usually, as you said, active in nocturnal or in the mornings or in the evenings. But if all that light's shining down on the water, they're not coming out to play. And I think it was Jason Randall's book, Trout Sense. He had an interesting, and it sort of made sense about how a trout has the pineal gland in the
Hmm.
top of their head that's light sensitive. And
Yeah.
when there's an intense full moon, no clouds, the moon looks like you can reach out and touch it. It's so big. That just because that gland governs the release of, I think it was serotonin, that has their rest and activity cycles, and it's almost like the analogy I use is kind of like jet lag. The poor fish are just wired and just out of sync, and so we generally like the period up to the full moon. We always find on lakes, whether it's a weather change, the period, it's like they sense something's coming that's going to upset their apple cart, so they put the feed bag on that almost to carry them through until things return back to normal, and then they go feeding again.
Yeah.
So yeah, but scuds. One of the things we did have, there was often a question of pregnant scuds, and they see that orange spot. And I'm just going to bring this back up again. So this is a pregnant scud because the female carries her eggs in a little pouch underneath herself called the marsupium, as I understand it, and they actually hatch inside this pouch, and when she sheds her skin, that releases them to carry on their generation. It's really kind of fascinating, and their blood system is more copper based, isn't it, Rick? So they're often that bluish color right after they've molted, until their exoskeleton hardens up and matches their surroundings again. We've done, and then of course, then there's this. This is an infected scud with this. It's almost like somebody took a Sharpie and just put a little spot on its back. And this is a cool little. You wonder where movies like Alien come from. This is a cool little parasite called a acanthocephalan. So this scud eats the egg. The egg embeds itself in the gut of the shrimp. The parasite hatches and starts to influence the behavior of the scud. Now, a scud that, as you talked about, Rick, is normally, doesn't like bright light. It's nocturnal. Now has an attraction to light. And this scud then, of course, is now swimming up in lighted and exposed, which trout find really nice and handy. Don't have to work nearly as hard. But the final completion of this parasite is the scud gets ultimately, hopefully, ingested by a waterfowl, and that parasite completes its life cycle in the digestive tract, and then the eggs are then excreted out, and the cycle comes again. So you often hear this pregnant versus infected. So if you see this little focus spot, that's an infected scud. It was I ran into a entomologist from New Zealand who was doing his PhD up in northern Canada studying scuds, and had some interesting, because early on I always assumed that was a pregnant scud. But it
Yeah.
turns out it's not. And I actually throat pumped this one out, and I could see that orange egg sac or egg pouch underneath. Right. So, but I always think it's good to have at times a little orange in them, whether it's in the midsection, a bead, thread. I don't think the fish hopefully don't mind where it is. It's just orange in some there.
Yeah. Good,
Um,
good stuff.
we're starting to get some good questions. Now we're in it. How long should my legs be on scuds? Longer than the hook gate? I usually trim them even. How about you, Rick?
I do, because I always worry about it getting in the way.
Yeah.
Fish taking, but yeah, trimming it even. I
Yeah.
like something soft too that's going to wiggle and move.
Yeah, I put CDC in a dubbing loop and,
Yes.
and palmer that over, and it's marabou like, and it just, it'll tuck along the sides if you strip it, or it'll come out and move. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
CDC is great for that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, there's a good one. I'll just hide our scud for a second. Has there been any study to insects reacting to salunar cycle? I think we touched on that a little bit, but any other studies you aware of, Rick?
Well, there have been some on some mayfly hatches related to moon phase, and they've documented some that prefer to hatch on a full moon, some that prefer to hatch on a new moon. Again, the insects never do it the same way among all the species.
Yes.
So, one thing I've always loved about entomology is there's an exception to every rule you can think of. But yes, moons phases can affect insect behavior.
Yeah.
And most of the insect behaviors aren't figured out well enough to tell you what it is.
Yeah.
But I think there is an influence on some of them. Yeah.
We've got a great question here from Linda McClellan.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, Jim. Phil, great you joined us, both of you. It's good to. Hopefully you're well. Miss you guys.
Yeah.
Can you explain the difference between two caddisflies? One that is fully enclosed in its house, and one that carries its house around. How do they transform into the next stage? Well, that's the periwinkle. What's that species of caddis that?
The October caddis.
Yeah, they're case makers, but there's also a species of caddis that almost I want to say a periwinkle. It just
The free living caddis.
yeah, but there's a type of case builder that just sort of stays fully enclosed, almost like I want to say a periwinkle, which is something from a kid. Those little.
The glossosoma.
That's the one. That's the one.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, the little saddle case caddis.
Yes. Yes.
The difference between two caddisflies, one that is fully enclosed in the house, and well, yeah. So I think, Linda, you might be thinking of the glossosoma, the little saddle case caddis. That's a little dome-shaped case that completely covers the larva inside. You don't see anything of the larva, and they crawl around on the rocks, scraping off the periphyte and the diatoms, and they pupate inside that same little dome case. And they're about the size, I always say to people, they're about the size of your little fingernail, those little dome cases. And that's not a lake species, strictly a stream species group. And then the others that carry their houses around, of course, there's many, many species of caddis that are going to carry their houses around and in lakes and in streams. And when they transform to the next stage, those that are carrying the houses around seal off both ends of the case, and they usually crawl somewhere protected before they do that. So it's under a rock or in the substrate, and then they seal off the case, and then it pupate inside the case that they were using as a larva. That's the typical approach.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. So it's I guess that glossosoma is not terribly exposed to feeding trout, is it? Other than when the pupa is going to the surface, or
actually, I've seen some things that really bring that into question, because I was doing a study for the Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Oregon, and they had 60 trout from the Deschutes River. They wanted me to do the stomach contents on that they electrofished, and these were adult trout. A half a dozen of those trout had pupa still in the silk cocoon of glossosoma.
Ooh.
And the only way they could have gotten those was by pulling the cases off of the rocks.
Yeah.
And so trout are out there, I'm pretty sure, actually grubbing on the surface of rocks, pulling those little glossosoma cases off.
Yeah. Well, we see that sometimes in lakes where you'll see them rooting chironomid larvae or scuds right out of the marl and almost like a bonefish. You know, I've got some video I shot with my drone of this fish, and you see the little mud trail going behind him as it's nose down and just rooting through, eating case caddis. You can see the little tracks from case caddis all over the bottom. It was fascinating to watch. I never caught him, but he was pretty spooky. Great question there, though. And this is probably a good question all along the West with the amount of forest fires we seem to have every year. The impact of the fires on the lakes, and I imagine on the rivers too, with all that ash and soot getting into the river and or the lake, and the lack of those trees being able to hold minerals back. Have you in your experience with that when you?
It's gonna have a significant effect potentially. More nutrients are going to end up in the lakes, and that can be good or bad depending on the lake and its condition. You could have some excessive algal blooms as a result of those extra nutrients. I wouldn't be surprised to start seeing some blue-green algal blooms in places which you don't want typically.
Yeah.
So I would look for something like that, some more heavy algal blooms in lakes that didn't used to have them. And on the other hand, if the lake is very oligotrophic, meaning really low in nutrients, it could stimulate some production there that would making it more productive and beneficial in the sense of fish growth.
Have you ever fished Roche Lake near Kamloops?
I have.
that lake has changed because with the explosion of the pine beetle, there was a lot of trees cut down, and that lake has become more and more productive. And years ago, it was pretty well a clear lake with marl shoals and chara. Now it's become quite cloudy. The water, the weed growth has changed. It's still fishing well, but
Yeah.
we're talking with Brian. It's become more and more eutrophic, and I want to say 5 years ago, maybe a little longer, it winter killed for the first time ever in the history,
Oh,
recorded history. And you
okay.
wonder, those kind of impacts brought on by, in that case, pine beetle. And now we're seeing all the forest fires and all the impacts they have on there. So,
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of process that would likely occur from fires. Yeah.
well, I think we've answered all the questions, Rick. And I just want to thank you again for joining me. How can people keep in touch with you if they want to learn more about entomology, more about Rick, more
Yeah.
about your escapades?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the
where can
best way is my website is just rickhafele.com. I've got a lot of info on there, a blog, a bug blog that I don't update as often as I should, but there's a bunch of them on there, and a lot of photos, gallery, and you can contact me and email me directly, and books for sale through the website. So
yeah,
it's pretty much all there on the website. I have an Instagram account, which is just photos I like to throw up.
yeah. No, you
Um,
become an incredible because you do a photo essay that you'll send out to people, and it's not always insects, but
I
you
do a monthly
become a
photo
very,
journal.
very accomplished photographer.
Yeah.
I
Well,
really
thank
enjoy,
you.
yeah, I
Thank you.
really enjoy your work.
Yeah.
You have a good eye for things in nature that most of us do. That's a mountain, and you see some other aspect of it that makes me want to look a little harder the next time
Yeah.
to see it
Thank
from the same view you do. Well, this has been great, Rick. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'd love to have you back. Maybe we could do a focused Callibatus night or beta, blue winged olive night or something, and really get into the weeds.
you. Okay.
But again, this is a talk. This is a live event, but it's also being recorded. So as soon as we finish this up, there'll be a recording both on my Phil Rowley Phil Rowley Fly Fishing Facebook page, and on my YouTube channel. So if you missed it, you came in halfway, or you want to recommend this to a friend, which I would recommend because Rick's just a wealth of knowledge. So you can watch it over and over and over again. And if you've got any other subject matter you'd like to see, either through these lake talk events I do like this, or I also do talk and ties where I do focused tying on certain things. I should do a scud one night, I think, from what I hear. But those kind of things, please let me know. Put those in the comments. And we've been, geez, an hour and 15 minutes. We should let people go. And I think we've covered all the questions. If we haven't, I'll do my best to answer them in the comments. But we should let Rick go. Let him go enjoy his evening. And thank you, everyone. And we'll see you on the next event.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks for everybody for showing up. It's been great.